Very much looking forward to your panel now and to a closer look at transatlantic partnerships from a specifically political perspective. Your moderator is Olle Schmidt. You know him already. Olle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I think it was one of the policy advisors to Mr. Clinton who said in the election campaign, it's all about economy, stupid. But what we have learned today, perhaps it's not. There is a shift. It's all about politics, and I will not say the rest. I think we should pass the microphone on, and you present yourself in that order, and then you can also give 5 minutes or whatever. We have some extra minutes because Erik Brattberg, the Swede, is not coming. He might say that there are too many Swedes here, so he would not come. But anyway, he's sick, so he apologizes. So we start with the French ambassador. You can make some introductory remarks. If you have the program, you can see the CV. It's well, it's a long, and you have been dealing with a lot of issues. You know all the answers, almost. Please.
So, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to congratulate the organizers of this panel for their great sense of understatement. Indeed, as I was looking for an appropriately diplomatic term to describe the current state of transatlantic relations, I couldn't really come up with any better term, or indeed a more diplomatic term, than multiple challenges. So congratulations. Multiple challenges we do face. And in fact, to measure the extent of the challenges we are facing, it takes only to go back to what was then called the New Transatlantic Agenda. The New Transatlantic Agenda was the last significant US-EU political agreement. It was signed in 1995. In itself, I think the date is quite telling. And it enables us to measure perhaps how far we have traveled backwards, or how far the EU and the US have traveled backwards. The New Transatlantic Agenda called for increased EU-US cooperation with 4 major goals. And let me quote these. The first goal, to promote peace and stability, democracy and development around the world. The second one, to respond to global challenges. The third one, to contribute to the expansion of world trade and closer economic relations. And the fourth one, to build bridges across the Atlantic. This was in the last century. Today, it would be actually quite tempting to affirm that what we are doing is exactly the opposite. So first, we disagree on how to promote peace and stability. It is clear from our differences, for instance, over the Middle East or over Iran. Second, we disagree on how to respond to global challenges, or even to the very nature of these challenges. For instance, the difference about climate change. Third, we are extremely busy stemming global trade and threatening our economic relations. And fourth, as streets go by, we are burning bridges with alacrity. Now, admittedly, I'm making this sound more serious and more consistent that things are in reality, but I think that you will agree that the pattern is there. And it's one where the US-EU relation today is roughly the exact opposite of what it was meant to be back in 1995. So I think one should not minimize the extent of the transatlantic differences. Some say, and they are quite right, that we've had spats before during the Reagan or the George W. Bush administrations. Obviously, this is the case. But I would submit that the difference between now and then is not just a difference in degree. It is actually a qualitative difference. We now have a situation where there is not just weariness or skepticism of the EU, but downright hostility. We now have a situation where there is not just weariness or skepticism of NATO, but a situation where the nature of the alliance, of any alliance, by the way, is being put in doubt. And finally, we have a situation where there is not just skepticism of multilateralism, but outright withdrawal from multilateralism, as we have seen over the JCPOA, the Paris Agreement, the UNESCO, the UN Council of Human Rights, etc. So under these circumstances, of course, it would be very tempting to plunge one's hand in the sand and pretend there is no problem. Many actually do succumb to that temptation, especially in this region, but I think we would do so at our own perils. Second, we shouldn't either exaggerate the extent of the transatlantic rift. Some say that things will never be the same. They point to the shift in power distribution around the globe and to the fact that, as we have been reminding this morning, for the first time in recent history, America is losing some of its edge in the economy and some sectors of technology. And there again, I would agree. But in my view, this is to ignore the fact that the underlying difference between the US and the EU is deeply political. The view in some ruling circles in the US is that multilateralism is the enemy of sovereignty. To take back control, one has to stand alone. This is the main idea. Also, I think, the idea which underlies Brexit. The majority view in the EU is still the opposite, that the only way to keep control and stay sovereign is through multilateralism. Multilateralism, in the European view, is not the enemy of sovereignty. It is its continuation through other means. It is its extension. It is its safeguard. But the difference is clearly one in political outlook and in philosophy, if you want to call it this, which in turn means that there is hope. It means that a different political configuration may yet produce better outcomes. At this stage, I think it's very important to stress that the transatlantic relation rests on a very sound basis. And I would really like to support what has been said this morning by the executive director of the US Czech Chamber of Commerce. And I can document this based on my own country's relation with the US. Not only do we have excellent military cooperation between France and the US, as we have seen, we are routinely conducting freedom of the seas operation in the South China Sea, for instance. We have proved that we were quite ready together with our British friends to take decisive actions in Syria in particular. We are both members of the coalition against Daesh, and conversely, the US are backing an excellent team player in our operations in Sahel. The same applies to the economy. The US is the first recipient of French outbound foreign investment, and vice versa. France is the first recipient of US outbound investment in the EU. You look at the polls and you would find that populations in the US and in Europe generally take a very good view and have a very good opinion of each other. And finally, as we just heard from Minister Petříček, we do share the same values, the rule of law, individual liberty, democracy, etc. So where do we go from here? And probably it's both unwise and presumptuous to propose recommendations, but since this is the name of the game, I would probably venture 3 recommendations. One general, one to the EU, and one to the US. The general one is to stay engaged. As Churchill might or might not have said, "War is better than war." So we need to talk more, we need to talk better. or to paraphrase the French-Irish writer Samuel Beckett, we need to disagree more, we need to disagree better. And I would say we need to act in a positive way, in a can-do way. I would even say in an American spirit to resolve differences. And as they say in the US, if it ain't broken, please don't fix it. To the EU, I would recommend to increase its unity and its ability to act. As we've heard also earlier this morning, the time of free riding is long past. Strategic autonomy is only another name for burden sharing. It is only if you're able to act, if you have the willingness and the capabilities to act, as well as the determination to fend for your own, to fend for yourself, that you can claim to be an ally. And to the US, I would recommend what they call the Pottery Barn Doctrine. If you break it, you own it. So don't think, I would say to the US, that withdrawing from multilateralism will make your life any easier. The opposite is true. Problems will fly back at you, but you will have to deal with them on your own. We Europeans have been where the US is now before. We've been through this discovery of our relative decline, of the decline of our relative weight. And we have found a supremacy to be challenged. And we have found, after many detours and tragedies, that multilateralism is the best extension of sovereignty. So I would say to the US, spare yourself the trouble of going the way we've gone. Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, thanks very much. My name is Josef from ECFR in Berlin. And I could make it very short by saying I agree with just about everything the ambassador has said. But then again, that's not possible. But I should try to say a little bit myself. And you will see I'm echoing a number of the things that the ambassador said, only on a lower level of sophistication, because he's the diplomat and I'm just the think tanker. And for sake of brevity, I skip the nuance, you know, and I just give you the main lines. And I think the main line is that actually this particular alliance across the Atlantic today is broken. It is gone, and I think it is gone for good. Which doesn't mean that there's nothing there. You know, the one thing is that I believe that actually alliances do not outlive or survive their founding purposes. When they do so unsuccessfully, they collapse, like the Warsaw Pact. When they do so successfully, they stay on, but become less and less decisive or less and less functional as a guiding framework for the actions of their constituent members. And along the lines of the ambassador, I think that actually in all three areas, in the political field, in the economic field, and in the security field, the United States and the European countries are drifting apart in a serious way. That doesn't cover everything, but it covers a number of the essential areas. And in the political field, I believe, like the ambassador said, the major cleavage today is the way that we look at a good international order. And I'm trying to look at the US position not in the Trump administration terms only, but in what I believe to be a more longer-term trend. And I think in the longer-term trend, Trump says it in his own rhetoric, but I think it's a bit of a political consensus already that the United States actually views the natural order of things in international affairs as being cooperation or conflict, interaction between sovereign states. And the sovereign state principle has returned to be the fundamental principle. And that has a good dose of hostility, as the ambassador said, to the idea of European integration. And that's why we're not just, having different views about, the ideal world, but we're having different views about what is the legitimacy of the political order which is decisive for Europe. And whereas we see the US administration putting very low credibility to the European Union, we tend to put still a very high credibility to that framework of action, and we would like to see that protected. And it's not just about our preference for multilateral institutions and negotiations. We actually believe, and I underline what the ambassador said, that by pooling sovereignty, we are enhancing sovereignty. And we're not taken away from the nation state, at least not from the European nation state, but we're protecting the European nation state by what we do. And in that sense, current rhetoric is extremely divisive, but I think the longer-term positioning of the United States leads to a different type of world. And we already see that the strongmanship, the emphasis on national interest, on national power, on the status of powers in the international arena proliferates into the second and third row of actors. Thinking of Turkey's President Erdogan and others. And we will believe a restructuring, we will see a receding of international institutions and processes. Now, one of the old terms used in one of Europe's most unstable neighborhoods, the Middle East, is that actually at some point we should get to something like a cooperation on security, and a conference on the cooperation and security in the Middle East. In the type of environment I'm describing, we will not see this. No, we will rather see attempts to sort of power broker some of the essential relationships and try to manipulate the rivalries that exist. In the economic field, we have praised the density of the relationship, and it's all true. But I think what is the essential point for Europe, we today begin to understand that international economics, global economics, is not so much more about creating a level playing field on which we then try to outcompete each other. But that the trend goes into the direction that the Chinese seem to be determined to deny Europe the coming generation of new technologies, to own them themselves, to use them as part of their continued economic success. While we see the United States gradually coming to the conclusion that they will not be able to outcompete China, but the point is to deny China further growth beyond a certain scheme. Because the United States is determined to not allow another country in this world to clearly surpass the United States in political and economic terms. And in this sort of environment of denials, where actually the level playing field is overshadowed or pushed aside by these strategies of denial, it becomes very complicated for us in Europe. And I think the scenario by which both Chinese leaders and US political leaders will look to us in Europe and say, of course you are on our side, you better are on our side. If you want to do business with us, you are on our side in whatever shape or form the conflict with the other takes. And we feel that we have very little leverage on how this conflict between the United States and China, which is a conflict over politics, over strategy, over security, over power, will play out. And the third element, obviously, the ambassador has found very kind words, and I think right words, on the good cooperation between France and the United States and such. But I think what we have to see is that the fundamental role of the United States in US security has fundamentally changed. Europe is a problem to the United States that has been solved. The defense of Europe is not in the vital interest of the United States, and the United States, in principle, believes that that Europe should be able to defend itself with additional support from the U.S. Insofar as as it sort of responds to U.S. interests. The real concern with Europe in terms of security and defense military policy is the inability of Europe to be actually a multiplier of US power in the world. You know, this very complicated history of the term out of area or out of business. The ambassador has given those examples of out of area activities where actually Europe delivers on that US expectation, and vice versa. Europeans find that the United States is a valuable partner in operations that they want to conduct, and in fact, like France does, that they also are leading. But the United States is no longer willing to cover the inability of Europeans to defend their territorial integrity. Now, and that is a fundamental change, and that you cannot pamper over with declarations by the alliance, and it does profoundly affect, over the longer term, the future, the role, the coherence of the transatlantic alliance. So my conclusion is that there is ample ground for partnership, because actually a Europe that drifts away is not an asset to the United States, but becomes a liability. But this partnership has to be built on a different base. It has to be built on the ability and the readiness and the willingness of the Europeans to defend and protect their interests, to foster their interests in economic, political, and probably also cultural terms in this world. Not against the United States, but for themselves. And if in some way the inability of Europe to protect its interests was the source of the previous close relationship and partnership across the Atlantic, then in the future I think it will be the ability of Europe to actually do this across the board, politically, economically, and in terms of its defense. That will be the basis of a continued partnership, and I believe that partnership between a more sovereign Europe, a more capable Europe, and the United States will be close, even though, and that follows, I think, from these divergences in these principal areas, it will be one of conflict as well. So I agree, the better we manage to deal with difference in our partnership, the better our partnership will be. Thank you.
I'm Jamie Fly. I'm the president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which the foreign minister was very kind to mention earlier, based here in Prague. I'm in an awkward position on this panel because I think I'm the only American. I was hoping my friend Eric Bradberg, even though he's not American, who lives in DC, would be with us so I could direct all the Trump-related questions to him. So you can send them my way, but I'm not here to speak on behalf of the Trump administration or the US government. Since the organization I run is an independent news organization which is funded by the US Congress. But I'm going to talk a little bit, picking up on the great presentations by the ambassador and by Josef. First about the structure of this. I agree generally with the assessment about the challenges we face in the transatlantic political space right now. But then I'm going to really delve into an issue that I work on now on a daily basis at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, is this issue of the deterioration of truth, which I do think is a key part of the challenges we're facing, and then end with a brief discussion of some of the values-related issues that the foreign minister brought up earlier. On the broad framing of the relationship, so I spent prior to 6 weeks ago when I joined Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty and moved here from Washington, I spent the last 2 years at the German Marshall Fund. I've spent previous years in and out of US government, working on transatlantic relations, among other issues. I generally agree with the pessimism. I must say, I hope I'm still a little bit more optimistic. It's in part why I joined an organization like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, given our history and given our current mission. But I guess my main difference, especially with Josef, is I don't really believe that this is a fundamental rupture across the Atlantic. I actually think that all of our advanced Western democratic societies are facing similar challenges. We ran a program at the German Marshall Fund when I was there, where we actually took Europeans outside of what we call the Beltway around Washington, D.C. We went to places like North Carolina and Missouri. And if you get outside of the urban areas, you engage so-called Trump voters, or even people who aren't Trump voters, but aren't part of the Washington, New York elite, you hear a lot of similar concerns when you travel regionally in most Western European countries right now, or even in Central Europe. I think we have broader divisions within our societies. We have regional, tribal divisions right now, and a broader sense that our politics are fundamentally broken. I think the level of frustration that average citizens have about their leaders across the transatlantic space is a shared concern. And again, honestly, in the US, that is not a Trump versus progressive issue. That's an average voter versus elite issue. It's a similar frustration that plays out in both parties, and I think you see that in many of the political systems here in Europe as well. Part of my worry about that, because I think ultimately there are some things that can be done to address that, but a key factor of that is this deterioration of truth and this sense that there's no common ground for people to engage in civic discourse. There's a declining respect for the media. Certainly that's the case in the US. I think it's the case in many European countries as well. That's created openings for some of our challengers. The Russians have become very adept at exploiting that and using this deterioration of our media ecosystem and the openings that have been created by this lack of trust to sponsor outlets of news that can operate on the fringes. And again, it's not an issue on only the right or the left, on both sides of the political spectrum. Social media and its role as a primary source of news and information for many of our citizens in advanced Western democracies has contributed to this as well. Just because of the nature, the commercial nature of many of the platforms, and the fact that the platforms were often too late to start to pay careful attention to the way that news and information was shared, and that the incentives that they built into the platforms didn't actually fan the flames of some of these trends that were already starting. And beyond Russia, China is starting to do similar things, and it's starting in its immediate neighborhood, and we've seen that more and more in the case of the way that the Chinese have tried to dominate the debate around events in Hong Kong or Taiwan just in the last year or two. And I think there's very real concern that over time they'll grab a page out of the Russian playbook and try to do the same thing in our societies. So it's a very concerning development from that perspective. So what should we, just if that's correct, and I do think that's an accurate assessment based on my work in recent years and coming out of the political world in the US and studying this in the think tank world, I do believe that shoring up a free and independent media is one of the most important things that we can do. It's a project that many of our governments are already working on individually. I think it should be something that is discussed more openly at the transatlantic level about how we can partner more effectively on such things. Some of the asks are very simple. The Czech foreign minister, I think, and the Czech government have modeled some of these things. Some of it's just as basic as providing moral support to journalists under pressure. A lot of the work that we do at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, is in closed or semi-closed environments. We have people who are harassed, sometimes denied accreditation, sometimes physically harassed, threatened by security services, and the more voices that push back against that, I think the more likely we are that free and independent media, especially in some of those frontline states, are going to be able to operate. I think adequately resourcing independent media. We have a number, like RFERL, you have entities like BBC, Deutsche Welle, who all in one way or the other get some sort of government support, but they have a firewall of editorial independence. I think more such initiatives are important that are truly independent. There's a trend, including in this region, for governments through political connections to actually support media, but it's often for media with a partisan purpose. And that can contribute to just more chaos and instability. I was in Tbilisi last week visiting our team there, and you can find multiple TV channels for basically whatever viewpoint you want in Georgia right now. And it's created an incredibly fractious political environment, and so that's not the direction we want to head. And so I think it's important that within the transatlantic space, that this trend towards media consolidation or media consolidation for political purposes be reversed as much as possible. We're trying to help contribute to that by relaunching, actually, upon advice from our overseers in Washington into services that we had closed down years ago. We launched a Bulgarian and Romanian service in the last year, digital platforms that we feel are now playing an important role in the media ecosystem in those countries. And we may, depending on guidance we'll be getting in the coming weeks, relaunch a Hungary service later next year. And so we believe that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty actually can play a role, including in Europe proper, in helping to deal with some of these challenges. Finally, I think we need to take more seriously the key challenge of disinformation. I mentioned just some of the space that's been created, and there's been a lot of positive steps in the transatlantic space, I think, to coordinate, to learn more from each other's defensive approaches to dealing with disinformation. I do think, though, that I have seen very little success at the governmental level, either in the US or here, tackle this challenge head-on from an offensive perspective and truly look at what better public diplomacy looks like from a government, better support for local NGOs in frontline states, better education and awareness raising of publics to help them deal with the barrage of disinformation and misleading information that is being directed towards them. And so I think that's an area where, again, there's a lot of great think tank and academic analysis, but at the government-to-government level, it hasn't been as high on the radar as it needs to be, and this is an area where we're dealing with very similar challenges. So I'll just end on the values piece, which the foreign minister mentioned earlier, and that's why I guess at the end I'm ultimately rather optimistic, because I think if you look at where we as a transatlantic community, as transatlantic democracies have come from, that's a history we should be proud of, especially in this year and the coming months as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of 1989. You see the challenges that our Central European allies struggled through with US support, with the support of US institutions, including Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. But what's most heartening for me is actually, I think we've become somewhat complacent, and we maybe are not engaging as much with our friends in frontline states or in closed societies, and that's what's been heartening to me in my first few weeks running Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where we're broadcasting to Pakistan, to Afghanistan, to Iran. I would spend a week in Central Asia, in places where our journalists are really the only independent news source. You have people who are both them, the journalists, and as well as the political activists they're often covering, are taking great personal risks, all to get what we have, what all of us enjoy in this room, which is fundamentally our freedoms. And if you look at the risks that they are willing to take, the people in Hong Kong, people in the streets of Moscow on a weekly basis, just protesting over being able to choose candidates for city elections, a very fundamental, basic issue, which quite frankly, most people in the West are probably not even paying attention to who's running in their city elections. I think we need to have a bit of a reawakening about how successful our societies have been, why they've been successful, and look at the passion and the commitment of those who don't enjoy our freedoms. And I think that hopefully might reinvigorate and give us a reason to celebrate the transatlantic relationship, because ultimately, I think those societies and the threats we're facing from countries like Russia and China are, or should be, serious reminders that this is all fragile and it can disappear, especially if the information and media ecosystem is corroded and we don't have that ability to engage in civil discourse. So I'll end there, but hopefully I'll end it a little bit more optimistically than Josef.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity and an invitation for this panel, which I believe is a very important team to discuss. My name is Tomáš Szunyog. I'm the representative of the Czech Republic in Political and Security Committee of the European Union, which is the body which deals with the foreign and security policy of EU in Brussels. And because I believe that a lot of things were already said about the Czech position on transatlantic relations, I would like to give probably more Brussels kind of angle to this debate. And I would probably start with saying that I very strongly believe that the transatlantic relationship is actually like an iceberg. So you see this only 10% of what is there and what is kind of attracting our attention, but there is this 90% which is below the level of sea and which is actually consisting of 300 years of common history, economic interdependence, cultural relationship, all those kind of films and products we are using on a daily basis. So I think it's much more solid than it looks like. But at the same time, we are in the era of climate change, and even the big icebergs kind of are threatened. So I think that there are some challenges we need to address today. And looking from the Brussels kind of EU side, I think that we have seen basically 4 structural issues which we have been struggling with coming from US. And the first is, and I'm sorry to repeat my colleagues, but and this is that very Thomas Hobbes kind of vision of the national states competing with each other, and basically being the fundamental kind of block of international relations, and competing with each other with the results being a zero-sum game. So it's just either winning or losing, nothing else. And of course, given this context, I think there is this deep suspicion of all the international organizations, multilateralism, and also international agreements. And we can see it on the UN. We see it on the WTO, the organization which basically was established as a part of this post-World War II American-led order, IMF, World Bank, but also on NATO and EU. So I think there is this kind of deep suspicion of any multilateralism at all. And I think that this is something which, when I look at it from the EU perspective, is of course kind of a fundamental problem. The second problem is also that there is this feeling that there is no kind of value in those relationships, that we all talk about community of values, but if we hear that North Korea is a wonderful country with a great prospect, while Germany is bad, I think one wonders how, who is the enemy and who is the friend. And I see that there is this lack of this kind of value-based international order, which also is kind of demonstrated by US getting out of the Human Rights Council and other kind of human rights, being less active on promotion of human rights. But also I just recently met the EU Special Representative on Human Rights, who just spent a week in Washington. He told me that there is this idea about actually promoting only the rights which are directly in the Declaration of Independence and US Constitution, and not the rights which are in the international treaties. And again, one can discuss that for a long time, but again, when the President of the US is saying the EU is as bad as China, only smaller, then I think that there is a challenge to address. The third structural problem is that this fusion of national security and trade and economy. And of course it's nice that the Prime Ministers are going to the White House to discuss car tariffs, but that's something which is also a difficult challenge for us, but also for, I guess, for other countries. I think Canadians discovered that very early on, but others. And also it's not only about the tariffs and taxes, it's also about sanctions. And of course, the most visible issue of sanction is JCPOA and sanctions on Iran. But also, we have seen kind of activation of Helms-Burton law on Cuba, and we also have seen looming issues of Nord Stream and other issues. So again, this fusion of or using the economy and trade and financial power to get a national security and foreign policy gains are something which is a challenge. And finally, there is this issue of this big country competition, in a sense that the national security strategy of the US, the most recent one, clearly identified China and Russia as strategic competitors. Even though I have sometimes personally a feeling that maybe the American presidents try to play or replay this Richard Nixon's trick and maybe just in the opposite kind of direction in making a deal with Russia to be able to deal better with China, which maybe is something which is discussed there. And of course, this is something which the EU is not feeling very comfortable in this triangle of US, China and Russia, the big guys doing this fighting in the cage very openly. So, as my dear French colleague, I would also like to offer three kind of things how to deal with those things. And exactly like he said, I think we need to stay engaged with the US on a positive agenda. And I believe we do have a positive agenda. Western Balkans is one obvious area where we can cooperate very effectively. Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, or Moldova, is area, and Georgia is the area where we can be very active. By the way, we are kind of thinking about the Eastern Partnership as something we just celebrated in the spring, the Eastern Partnership 10th anniversary. We believe that this is a topic which will stay with us and should stay with us also throughout the Czech presidency of the EU into 2022. We do have other areas, Africa. I mean, I expect a major shift of EU attention to Africa in coming years, not only in the foreign policy, but also in the trade and investments and migration and development. So I think that this is the continent where we can be quite useful doing things together. Afghanistan, even though there are some kind of uncertainties now, but again, the US and EU can work very effectively in Afghanistan together. This is something which is a topic which we have had several discussions with Mr. Ambassador Khalizad. He actually specifically asked us to be active there and to help. North Korea, other issues, I think global issues as well. The second thing, we need to be much more realistic about our own efforts. I think we should use less of this kind of big words and being more realistic on dealing with our partners and friends and enemies. And I would say that we have made a good progress with China in the spring. We've been preparing the summit, EU-China summit. I think we have had a good result of that. Maybe also because the Chinese felt pressure from Washington, but nevertheless. I think we need to be much more realistic about Russia and its intention in disinformation and hybrid threats and others. But I think we need to be kind of, again, maybe more kind of practical and less rhetorical. Finally, I think we need to engage more with other like-minded partners. Obviously, countries like Canada, Japan, South Korea, ASEAN, some of the ASEAN countries, India, Mercosur countries, I think those are natural partners for the global issues, and I think that we need to be more engaging and more practical again in our engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for excellent introductions, I would say. It was part of a lecture at university. But I have some tiny questions for you. Then I think you should share your views among yourself, and then we will put in some questions and comments here. Mr. Ambassador, I think that President Macron was brilliantly handling the Yellow Vests. He was out in town hall meetings. I'm used to French presidents as Mitterrand, and when he visited Stockholm, he was more royal than our king. And I think that was a sort of new dimension, and I think we need that more in European politics. I would like to hear your comments in that sense, because I think it plays out in a difficult European world that we also have dialogue with the ordinary citizens in a good, decent way. We cannot listen. We cannot do what they are saying all the time, but we need to listen. I think that was actually rather brave from the French president. I would also say that you are saying burden sharing. When I was in the European Parliament, I used to say responsibility sharing, because this is what it's all about. It looks like everything is a burden for everyone. Josef, I think did you end in a positive way? I think you were a bit negative, but perhaps we are supposed to be that here in a way. But don't you think that, I read an article in The Economist saying that if the Americans think that the defense of Europe is not important for them, they are absolutely wrong, because it is. It's vitally important for them. And we might also remember what happened in the 1930s. The Americans, after Woodrow Wilson, they were totally uninterested in helping Europe and assisting Europe, and it ended in Pearl Harbor. That brought them in. So history should be wisely mentioned, but wouldn't you say that we could at least try politely remind the Americans of that? The media, Jamie. I've been a journalist as well, and I've always been fiercely against subsidies, but now I'm not. I think we need that, because when I'm subscribing my newspapers, even Financial Times, it's extremely expensive. You can have it on the internet, but it costs money. Do you think we can have a system, a European system, that actually would support independent media on the net and like ordinary news magazines? To Tomáš, you mentioned climate change, and I think there was a hint here previously that we have not mentioned it enough. Do you think strategically, politically, concerning and related to the transatlantic relations, that this could be something that could open some new doors? I will not mention this climate activist, but she has opened, at least I can talk for myself and my country, a lot of doors. She's criticized enormously, but that's the internet we are talking about. But could you think that even a businessman and a president like Mr. Trump could be interested in finding solutions concerning the climate? Please, shall we take it from Tomáš to the ambassador, and then we open the floor. You can say whatever you want. You don't need to answer my question.
Thank you. I think that actually the climate change is the one issue which is very on the very top of the EU agenda. And if you look at the last, I think it was in June in the European Council, I think that the vast majority of countries of the EU, and regardless whether it's a kind of rational or based on the pressure from the public, but wants to have a serious EU climate agenda. And I think that now the summit in New York and maybe the European Council in December would actually agree on that. But I think that our Minister of Trade and Prime Ministers are very right in the sense that the EU is 10% of the overall climate challenge. And I think that this is something where we can engage. And my understanding is that even China is looking into it more seriously and trying to, maybe they are too successful, because if you look at those solar panels, they now produce 80% or 90% of those. The same thing about wind turbines and other things. So I think different countries are approaching it differently. And of course the big debate about the climate change would be whether, let's say in the Czech Republic, whether the nuclear power is actually climate friendly or not, and we can have a different opinion on that. But politically, I think this is currently one of the issues which is dividing the US and EU. Even though I noted that different US states on the state level are actually much more active, and California is leading, but obviously other countries, and even the automotive sector in the US is actually voluntarily trying to abide by the most demanding standards. So I think that it will be difficult, but it certainly, I see it as an issue which would be with us more and more, and would define the EU policy internally, but also externally more and more. And the question is how the Czech Republic wants to position itself in all this debate.
briefly on media, I mean, I think it's a good question. This has been one of the most troubling things even before I joined Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, looking at disinformation and the way in which the decline of especially local news outlets, especially local newspapers in the US, had created these openings for much more rampant spread of disinformation. A lot of Americans who used to turn to a daily newspaper, which was supported by classified advertising by local companies and others, now go online. They go on Facebook, and whatever the news feed shows them, or whatever their Twitter feed shows them, those algorithms are essentially filling the role that the editors of those local newspapers, who were much more connected, both they abided by certain standards in most cases, but they also were connected to the real interests and needs of that local community. In the US, we've been having this debate about what to do now. I mean, some individuals who made a lot of money off of social media platforms, which helped contribute to the death of local news, I think are investing in some projects to now prop up local newspapers. So I think everything that can be done privately to support a flourishing and vibrant local news outlets is important. And so I don't know in the US if the government would probably be able to intervene in that way, other than to deal with it more from the regulatory angle of how social media companies wield the great power that now resides in their hands. From a European perspective, I think the more that European governments can do to support free and independent media, both within Europe, but also, like I said, on the frontline states or in closed societies, it's much more powerful. And I've seen cases, met with EU representatives in some of the Central Asian countries I've visited recently. When we have journalists under pressure, when it's not just the US ambassador speaking out and complaining to that local government, but it's a multitude of voices from European and other embassies expressing concern. Because the interesting thing is a lot of these governments, especially those that are not completely closed societies, they want the veneer of respectability, and they want the veneer of a free and independent press. They don't want to shut down every bureau that exists in their country. They actually want to cling to one or two bureaus. Now they want them to operate within certain certain guidelines. And so they actually take that criticism and that pressure seriously. The one final thing I'll add just on the resource side, it's been astonishing to me to see how much Western governments are being outspent in this area when it comes to supporting free and independent media. We've known about the amount of money that the Russians under Vladimir Putin have invested in this, the Chinese in their various efforts. I was just told earlier this week we have a service in Kazakhstan which is incredibly successful, Radio Azatik. It's one of the only independent media outlets. The government of Kazakhstan has invested 3 to 4 times the annual entire budget of my organization, which covers 27 languages, soon to be 27 languages, into Kazakh state TV. So even a country like Kazakhstan is willing to back up their media efforts with significant resources, much more than one project that's funded by the US Congress. I think that's just a lesson about where the authoritarians see the importance of the media space and their efforts to control it. And I think it should be a warning and hopefully a clarion call for further action from Western governments.
To respond to your question, begin with this notion of optimism. I think my optimism stems from the inconsistency of my pessimism. When I said that this close Atlantic alliance is broken and basically for good, shouldn't the same apply to the European Union then? You know, if alliances don't outlive the purpose of their creation, why should that apply to NATO but not to the European Union? So since I did not share any doubts about that with you, even though I think there is grounds to be doubtful about it, but I still believe it's not that I think that the transformation of that relationship is the crucial problem. I think we come out of an era that has been exceptional in a number of ways. And it will not basically end and we fall back to where we were before. But we go into a slightly different configuration. And I believe that in that configuration there will be ample grounds, ample reasons, and ample opportunities for the United States and Europeans, or for the United States and Europe, to partner with each other. So that's why I feel myself, I'm optimist. I just think that the notion that we must hold on to what we had in order to not lose everything is probably not the right one, is not adequate. The other point that was raised by the chair was the question of whether actually for the US the defense of Europe is of vital interest. My argument is it was, but not anymore. What was vital for the United States about security in Europe? A, was to control for the rise of another anti-order power like Nazi Germany was. I think the big mistake in US global thinking after World War I was, okay, this was the war to end all wars, and we have created an institution, we have created a framework, and we've done what we could to make the conditions for the defeated party halfway bearable. Job done. And the recognition after World War II was no, it was not, that actually the way that World War I unfolded and how it ended and what happened afterwards was part of the rise of Nazi Germany and the entire revisionist aggressiveness that destroyed Europe again another time and forced the United States again to intervene into something that they were not inclined to intervene in the first place. So today, I think the Washington consensus is that this is history. We do not need to fear the emergence of another Nazi Germany. Because A, there's only one Germany around, and there is trust that this Germany will not regress to the Germany of the 1930s again. You never know, but I think there is some reason to believe that. And for that matter, that part of US commitment to Europe in order to prevent that another such conflict could escalate into a war that would threaten and confront US interests, US security, is basically dealt with. And the other one was to deny Russia the control of Europe was absolutely essential to secure US primacy in the world. Even when both powers were on a rough strategic par as regards mutual assured destruction, it was still an important motive to actually say you cannot have access to the most valuable neighborhood that you have, and that is Central and Western Europe. To deny Russia, to deny the Soviet Union that access was absolutely essential to preserve the US position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and in the world. When you look at the situation today, this is not a risk. Now, whatever you may think about the security threats to Estonia or other countries, Russia probably is incapable of controlling Europe. And it is capable of destroying Europe, certainly, physically, but is not capable of winning Europe. I think Russia, in what it is, not because of its Soviet past, maybe in part, but for what it is, it lacks the resources, it lacks the power, and it lacks the attractiveness to be in control of Europe. So for the United States, the remaining question is, why don't the Europeans, with all the means they have, do what's missing is make sure that an armed aggression against their territory will not be successful? And I think that's a fair, absolutely legitimate question. And we could do that. And probably one of the reasons why we're not doing it has to do with the presence of the United States. Because we could do this if we pooled our defense resources to the level of effectiveness that we have pooled our markets. But that would require a political configuration which runs consistently against the interest of the United States, particularly that the defense environment in which the United States wants to operate is an environment of sovereign national states, and not an environment where you have sort of forms of supranational integration in the defense field. NATO is determinedly an intergovernmental alliance and is not meant to be go beyond that. NATO in all of its decades has developed two collective assets. The one is SHAPE, the other one is AWACS. I submit to you, it's not a collective asset. But it's a collectivizing event, but it's not a collective asset. It's not an asset that is owned by all members of the alliance and the costs are shared. Now, that there's only two, SHAPE and AWACS. And I submit to you, 20 years down the line, unless we go our crazy normal European ways, the European Union will own at least 5 or 6 collective assets of military significance. From a military satellite system to drone systems to airlift systems, etc. This is, in my view, the rationale of PESCO. PESCO does not make sense if it doesn't lead to assets that the parties have developed, financed, and maintained together. To make it available to members, to the organization at large, or to partner organizations such as NATO when need be. Stop here.
Thank you. Please, Mr.
Perhaps two quick points to reply to your, I'm not sure it was a question actually, but burden sharing, responsibility sharing. Yes, burden sharing is not my word. It's the word which is normally used in the context of transatlantic debates and which is actually used by the Americans, but I would absolutely agree to also use responsibility sharing. That's not the issue. I would like to pick up on two things that I think both Josef and Tomáš said, and which I think is quite well taken and quite interesting. On the one hand, you have this strategy, I think it was your term, of access denial, denial of technology, denial of access to market. Access denial is normally a concept that comes from the military. It's a tactic whereby you essentially forbid an adversary to gain access to a theater, to use military parlance. So on the one hand, you have perhaps what you could call the securitization or the weaponization of trade, while on the other hand, if you hear some current talk about Article 5, you may be under the impression that you have exactly the opposite, or the reverse. You have the tradification of security. Would you like to save Montenegro? The question is, well, it depends what sort of planes they buy, is the answer. So you have the transformation of an alliance, which in itself should be unconditional, into a transactional relationship based on trade. So you have this symmetry there of securitization of trade and tradification or commodification of security, which I think leads me to the final idea that we in Europe are perhaps in danger of, again, becoming a staging ground for great power rivalry. We can see that particularly in this country. Look at the Huawei story in the Czech Republic. Look at the pressure which is being exercised on the one side, and look at the pressure which is being exercised on the other side. And this, in my view, is only a forerunner of things to come. So we have, I think, as Europeans, a very simple choice. Do we want to go back to where we have been for a very long time? Do you want to stay as a battleground, essentially? Or do we want to become part of that conversation? And there I would absolutely agree with what Josef has just said. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, there has to be some question, or at least some comments. Please. Yeah.
Vladimir Sokol with the Jameson Foundation in Washington, formerly with Radio Free Europe in Munich. West Europeans tend to read too much into President Donald Trump's rhetoric. If you look beyond that rhetoric, you will see the US, the Trump administration's deep commitment to Europe's defense as a rock-bottom principle of American foreign policy. The Trump administration has reversed the neglect of Europe that had characterized the Obama administration. The Trump administration has invested many billions of dollars into the deterrence and defense capabilities on the eastern front of NATO, where the threat is. And that is taking place as a national US initiative, partly routed through NATO, but mostly outside of NATO's framework, leading to a bilateralization of defense commitments on the Eastern Front, away from the collective NATO, toward bilateral ties with the threatened countries. The threatened countries welcome this. They do not read Trump's rhetoric the way the West Europeans do. And the Trump administration's policy on the Eastern Front, which is where it counts, enjoys bilateral support in the US Congress. This needs to be made clear when you assess the commitment of the Trump administration to the European defense, and I'm convinced that it will last, it will continue beyond the Trump administration's first term. Thank you.
My name is Alexander Tipachuk. I'm from Ukraine, East European Security Research Initiative Foundation. And my question is, how do you see the place of East European countries, especially Ukraine, Georgia, or Moldova, in these kind of challenges for transatlantic partnership? Because we are quite countries in between, and we should keep a kind of balance between US policy and between EU policy as well to survive, because this is an existential issue for us, first of all. And just as a question for distinguished panelists, how could you explain the role and place as a future policy of East European countries? How it should behave for us to exist in this kind of new challenges existing in transatlantic partnership? And as a last example, it will be the new agreement on prolonging existing contracts for natural gas transportation to the Europe, because nowadays we have a third round of talks now going in Brussels between European Commission, Ukraine and Russian Federation. And this is an example how we should exist and how we should keep balance between all these things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, gentlemen, can you on 6 minutes divide yourself and the questions and give some smart remarks? Shall we start with you, Mr. Ambassador?
The second question, perhaps, because I don't think that yours was really a question; it was more of a remark. But what is the role of, or what is the prospective prospects of the countries that you referred to as in between? One, I think, at present, of course, the most pressing task would be to put an end to what has been called frozen conflicts in the area. Frozen conflict is Russian domination by another name, which is why any engagement that we have with Russia probably has to be premised on the notion that we must address these conflicts, Ukraine, but also Georgia, but also Moldova, etc. So this is if you go through the list in sequential order, this would be the first thing. The second thing is that all these countries at various levels and at various degrees have already launched partnership relationships with the EU, which sometimes include custom unions, sometimes visa liberalization, sometimes both, sometimes more. Some of them are less interested. Azerbaijan, for instance, not really interested in having a privileged partnership relationship with the EU. It's different for the others. But this is certainly part of encompassing these countries in the wider projection area, I would say, of the EU. And I would think that this is perhaps at this stage the only hopeful perspective of stabilization for these countries.
Tomáš, Josef, you can conclude.
Yeah.
Because you have the comments.
I would probably fully agree with my French colleague. Just to add one thing, I think that actually the problem for the countries in between is that Russia perceived it as a kind of competition with the US, while in reality I think that much more can be done on the EU Eastern Partnership and those countries. But I think the first thing is for actually those societies and the countries themselves to reform themselves and succeed, because I think, frankly speaking, that the biggest challenge for people now sitting in Kremlin is successful, prosperous and safe Ukraine. I understand it's kind of difficult to do it when you give 5% of your GDP to your defense, and if you lost, hopefully temporarily, part of your territory. But I still believe that it's much more to be done in internal reforms to really make Ukraine a successful country, because that would be something which even the normal Russians would understand, that if there is a country which can develop differently and outside of this control of Russia, then I think that's the biggest challenge Russia can face. I mean, and there are a number of issues. You mentioned the gas issue. I mean, we have been talking about Avtohaz and reforms and unbundling of Avtohaz for years, and nothing is happening. Even when we ask why there are no metering stations on the border between Ukraine and Russia to meter how much gas actually is pumped to Ukraine from Russia, there is no kind of normal answer to me. The first metering station is on the border between Ukraine and Slovakia. So what is the problem actually to have exactly the figures? And I suspect there is some answer for that. Agriculture reforms. When I was in Kiev 3 years ago, still from Prague, and I met with the Czech entrepreneurs there, what is the biggest challenge for them? And they say agriculture reforms and ownership of land, because if you don't own the land, you cannot ask the bank for the mortgage, and cannot develop the company properly. So if there is no institution of the private property rights in the agriculture, then it's kind of difficult. And I believe the Ukrainian agriculture, if developed properly, can be again, as it was in 19th century, the most richest agriculture in Europe. By the way, challenging France on that. So, I mean, there is a number of things can be done, and I hope this government of this president, with a majority in the parliament, can finally kind of start things which have been delayed already since '91.
Very briefly on, I just want to reinforce Vladimir's point actually, because it picks up on what I was talking about earlier. I think we need to move beyond the transatlantic relationship. I understand the importance of the high-level messaging of our leaders and the fact that the high-level messaging of Donald Trump or other US officials can create political problems here in Europe. But the reality is that there are much deeper trends going on here underneath the surface that started well before the current US president, about where American society, I think, was headed, about the inward-looking nature of American politics to a certain extent, and they span across the political spectrum. And so, you know, I agree with Vladimir's assessment about what the Trump administration has done compared to the past. But, you know, I think in general we'll see going forward US governments that tend to be more unilateral perhaps than in the past. People forget the Obama administration reset with Russia was done over the heads of Central Europe, and to significant cries from this region about them being neglected and left out. And so this is not just the tactics of one administration, of one political party. I think that's something that we'll have to factor into the transatlantic relationship going forward. And then just finally on Josef's, I think, very good analysis of US views of what they want from Europe. I think part of the challenge is U.S. citizens, U.S. leaders have heard from a succession of European leaders that we won't need you anymore in the future. I went back before I moved here to Prague and looked at Václav Havel's speech to Congress, and his whole argument was, it's in your interest for us to succeed in European integration project because we don't want to have you send your young men to die again on our territory. And he was not the only one who was making that argument over recent decades to the American people and to their leaders. And I think it was a compelling argument for Americans because even to this day, people have those memories of their grandparents or ancestors who had to pay the ultimate sacrifice. So I think, honestly, at the average level in the US and your average citizen, there's a lot of interest if Europe and support, despite, again, some of the high-level messaging, if Europe is serious about taking on its own defense, if Germany and others are willing to commit the resources, I don't think you're going to see a lot of criticism ultimately from the US. The challenge is there's still this expectations and anticipation of what could be possible, but a lot of frustration with what various US administrations have seen in practice.
Please, finally.
Okay, thanks very much. I think I would fully agree with what Vladimir was saying, and at the same time, sort of put one question to the next panel, to the security panel, because in my view, it's not all that it's just pure and genuine love, let's say, between Poland and the United States, which expresses itself in US commitment to defense in Poland. But it is also, there's an element in there of managing the lack of trust. Part of the Polish insistence on issues like, on plans like Fort Trump, is to have evidence, have proof of America's commitment to the defense of Poland. As far as I see it, the Polish don't trust the Germans. They don't trust other Europeans in sort of coming to their defense. Maybe that's a political problem for Poland and for Europe to address. But they also don't trust the United States to do that. And that's why they want to have US presence on the ground. That's why they insist on the tripwire deployment that will make it inevitable for a US administration to react to any form of conflict that should or could emerge on the Polish border. And that's something, I'm not criticizing that, but I say this is, it's all part of the same story. We need to bear that in mind. I think my Polish colleague my Czech colleague, I'm sorry, has put it very well with regard to Ukraine. I think the last US administration that was willing to invest resources into Ukraine in order to punish Russia was the Clinton administration. And the Europeans have always been on the track that you have described. Yes, we are ready to intensify cooperation with all Eastern Partnership countries, but on the grounds of the merit of the case. All policies that are designed to extract resources from partners by the appeal to the Russian threat will not succeed. And I think that has been a continuous feature in Ukrainian politics, that there was always this temptation. Couldn't we put ourselves in a position where we can cry for help? And I think and every new administration has given some reason to believe that this administration now finally would understand this and try to make progress on the other items of the agenda which are known to everyone. And I think it was part of the, that's my last sentence, part of the Franco-German consensus when launching Normandy is to do this, to actually manage an unacceptable situation on principle terms in order to shift the emphasis of the then Ukrainian government to primarily address its economic, its governance reform issues in order to demonstrate that Russia was unable to use a destabilizing conflict to derail economic transformation of Ukraine. And I think we have not been thoroughly successful in conveying that message because we could not do it. The logic of European involvement is that you have to do it in order to win support and attention from Europe.
Thank you very much. I think this has been extremely interesting. 100 years ago, there was 80% of the Americans had relatives or in families in Europe. Today, it's only 10%. Perhaps that's a part of the answer. Now it's coffee break. You have to drink it very fast, I'm sorry to say. But gentlemen, thank you very much.